Modifying your installation. In this nugget, we're going to be taking a look at a few different things, very important for our exam objectives. The first one is just a practical matter of showing you how to enable remote desktop. This is very useful not only for my own training purposes, so that I can show you these things, but also for your own purposes as you remotely administer servers across your enterprise. I'll also take you a look here at switching installation modes. In the past, we've only been stuck with Windows Server 2008 Core Edition or Full Edition. Now in Windows Server 2012, we're not stuck with that anymore. We can change our minds. Also, we can use something called Features on Demand, and really what this does is it allows you more or less to uninstall features more than install features, because if you have something you don't need, you can remove the binaries and save yourself some disk space. We'll take a look here also at Minimal Server Interface, which will remove all the binaries that you don't need, strictly speaking, for basic administration. So you'll be left with just some basic UIs, so it's not quite core, but it's not quite a full installation either. And then also we'll take a look at how to add and remove features in offline images. In other words, your virtual hard disks from Hyper-V. Alright, now one of the first things I want to show you is slightly off topic, and that's going to have to do with remote management. The only reason I'm showing you this brief part here in order to enable remote desktop is because I have to show you that in order to demonstrate some of the things I'm going to do here shortly. So let me give you a little bit of background first of all. The computer we're looking at right here is called HV Nugget 1. It's a physical server, and it's got Hyper-V installed on it, as you can see. And if I wanted to get to Hyper-V, the management console, a couple of ways of doing that. I could right-click on the server name right here and choose Hyper-V Manager, or I could go up here to Tools, and then down here is Hyper-V Manager right here. Okay, so either way it works, and you can see I've got two virtual machines running right now inside of this physical machine. One of those is a core computer, and one of those is a full computer. Now, what I would like to do is to be able to use remote desktops from my Windows 7 computer to connect to these two computers, or to just use the remote desktop client. Either one would work. It's just that I like to consolidate everything in a single console if possible. And you can see what I've done over here within remote desktops is that I would like to be able to click on full over here and make a connection to it over here on the right, or also to click on core and likewise to make a connection over here on the right. Okay, so how do we accomplish that? Well, first of all, the full edition has already been done. So if I click on the full edition, then you can see I'm already connected to that one. Now, how did I do that? How did I make this possible to make this remote session? This remote desktop connection that we've got going on here, this server could be a virtual machine on the other side of the planet. It could be in a server room in a different building somewhere. Or it could be just a few feet away from me as a virtual machine in another box, just like we're doing here. So the way I'm able to enable that function, though, is I got to go to the local server item over on that virtual machine, which again is my full server, full GUI server. And then give this a moment to refresh. It has to kind of populate all of these unknown items. But you'll see the one I'm really looking for is remote desktop. Now, remote management is enabled by default. I could click on that and disable that. But this would, by leaving that selected, it allows WMI scripts and things to search out this machine and conditionally, possibly, perform certain functions or allow certain functions on it. But I'm going to go to remote desktop. By default, it's disabled. You see that I've already enabled this one, but all you have to do is to click down here to where it says allow remote desktop connections to this computer. All right? And then you can also allow only remote desktop connections from those that allow network level authentication, which is a higher level of authentication. So let's click on select users here. Now, this is not a good security practice. I clicked on add down here and shows everyone. I don't do that in production. I only do that for training in this case because I need to be able to make a connection to this server as other users at various times that might not be administrators, only in order to demonstrate certain things. But otherwise, you'll leave it only for administrators in most cases. All right? So, now once I did that, it was enabled, and now you can see I did indeed make this connection using remote desktops. Again, I'm using this remote desktops item here where you can consolidate all of them into a console. Or I could use a single remote desktop client to make a single window connection to that same server. But that's how I do it for the full GUI version. Try to get this back in my little recording area. Can't seem to quite get right on the pixels. But anyway, now for the core side, let's take a look at that one. If I go back over here to my physical machine, we'll see that if I double-click on core right here, Yeah, I can access the console here. And, as you would expect with Core, all I get is a command prompt. If I needed PowerShell, I could type PowerShell and press Enter. But there's no UI, there's no link to click to enable remote desktops. So what we need to do in order to make this work is we have to use a C script, which is just a command line version of something called a Windows script host. But anyway, it allows me to access and work with certain types of scripts here. So what I'm going to do is to type in C script, and then there's a script that's already on the machine under Windows and System 32. As you can see, I'm already in that directory. And it's called scregedit, okay, .wsf. And I want to do an AR and then a V. Now, the V is all that's going to do is to show me the current state of this. If it returns to me a 1, as you see right there, that means that it's not enabling remote desktop. So I want to switch that. So I'm going to repeat the same command, and I just press the up arrow key to repeat that command. I'm switching it over to a 0 now, and now if I look at the V, we can see that it is now enabled as a remote desktop connection. So I'm going to close this Hyper-V virtual machine connection window right here. The core machine is still running, as you can see. But the next thing I want to do now is I'm going to go back over here to my remote desktop. So I'm going to click on Core, and I've already entered in the IP address. So hopefully, if I did everything right, then I'm going to be able to just right-click on this and choose Connect. And now it's asking me for credentials. Okay, hopefully I typed the... Nope, I didn't type the password right. Let's try that again. All right, there we go. Okay, so now you can see I'm able to successfully make this connection remotely now. This is kind of handy because you will need to be able to do this, and a lot of server administrators just sit in a cubicle and they make remote connections to dozens or hundreds of servers all day long in far-flung portions of the world that they may never even physically touch that machine or log on to the console, but they need to be able to administer it somehow. This is just one way to do it. The other way to do it would be to use Server Manager, but that works best in a domain environment, which we don't have yet. Now, we just took a look at Server Core, and you might not be too familiar with Server Core or not feel very comfortable with it. That's certainly how a lot of administrators felt in Windows Server 2008. So what we're able to do now in 2012 is to switch between installation modes, because you see, in 2008, if you installed Core, because after all of the best administrators in the world are using Core, right? all your friends are using it, and they're all talking about it. Geez, I guess I better get on the bandwagon and install Core, right? Well, then you kind of felt yourself lost sometimes. A lot of administrators did, where they just, let me show you, they're just staring at this thing. And they're saying, okay, now what? There's nothing to click on, so I don't know how to quite configure anything, and I haven't memorized all the PowerShell scripts yet, or PowerShell commandlets, so now what am I going to do? Well, what you can do here is if you find yourself in a stuck situation, for example, and you've got some buyer's remorse from installing Core, well, you can switch over to full now. Now, several different tools to do that. You can use DISM, which is the Deployment Image Servicing and Management tool, which is often used for deployment purposes, obviously. But you can use it also for this switchover if you want. You can also use a Remote Server Manager. Even though you're connecting to a Core computer, you can use Server Manager and you get a full UI making a connection to the Core machine. So using that, you're able to add and remove features as necessary. I'll talk to you about that here and which ones you need to add or remove as we go. And then there's also PowerShell itself, which you can use even on the local console or remotely. But we'll use it on the local console to install a Windows feature. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate some of that here shortly, but before we move on, I want to point out that one of the exam objectives says that you need to be able to know how to configure Server Core. What does that really mean? Well, think about it. Again, you don't have a UI, so almost anything you do is going to be PowerShell scripts, or using some kind of remote server administration tools, or remote server manager, or something like that. So there's really nothing else that you can do directly on Server Core. So in terms of this specific exam objective, this is something we'll learn as we go along, because anytime I show you a PowerShell script, well, you can run that on Server Core. Alright, now here what I've done is gone to Server Core that I want to convert to a full GUI. Now, I typed all this in advance, so you didn't have to watch my insane typing skills. Yeah, typing is one of my many incompetence. Not incompetence. Typing is one of my many incontinence. Now that doesn't sound right either. Typing is one of my many accomplishments. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Anyway, I'm good at it. It's just that I've got lots of typos. So what I want to do here is I want to show you what I did. I typed in PowerShell here. Took me to a PowerShell prompt. Then I went to import module server manager. Okay. In PowerShell, by the way, as a quick side note, Microsoft does not preload all of the modules for us. We have to load them one at a time, whichever set of commandlets we want to use. The reason for that is because it's easier on performance if you just load your own that way. Okay. So then what I'm going to do is, once I'm in the Server Manager module, I have the commandlets for install Windows feature, server GUI management infrastructure, server GUI shell, and then restart. Now, if you want to pause the screen, you can look at this if you like. Also, I do have a cheat sheet of all the PowerShells that I'm going to be showing you throughout this series. It's available for you up on NuggetLab.com. That way, you don't have to stare at the screen and furiously write down on a notepad everything that I'm showing you here. All of this stuff is available for you, so relax, okay? All right, then I'm going to go ahead and press Enter to get this going. I didn't have to throw the restart flag in there, but I did, because otherwise, if I'm not manning this machine, then it could sit there indefinitely with a prompt asking me if I want to restart or not. Also, I could have used a -remove. That would remove all of the GUI binaries. You see, it's doing this installation right now for me because the GUI binaries are actually still on disk. It's just that Windows isn't using them and hasn't exposed them, and it doesn't load a GUI until after I run all of this. If I were to use the remove flag, which you actually do more likely in the reverse when you're uninstalling all of this, then it will take all those binaries off so that it will reduce the disk footprint. Alright folks, this thing took so long to install the UI that it kind of got at a sticking point actually at about 68%, and I was wondering if it was hung or whatever. Finally, I got hungry and went to Subway, got a sandwich, and as I came back and came into the office, I saw that this thing had just rebooted. So here we are. Now I've logged on, and you can see we have the full UI in front of us. Let me point something else out here as well, and this is where you might want to make a switch from the GUI to the core. Let's say that I don't feel all that competent with a lot of the server tools that are in PowerShell, and so I really just want to use a UI. Well, I might install a full GUI, and it would look, of course, just like what we have right here. Then I could do all of my configuration, I could add all my roles and features, I could click on all the different kinds of stuff. Once it's done, though, then I'm pretty comfortable remotely administering it from my cubicle using remote server administration tools or remotely connecting down through here somewhere, something like that. If that's the case, I can still remove the full GUI, and I can do that from within this interface. I would do that by going up to Manage, and then Remove Roles and Features. And then what I would do is click on just Next, and I'm going to select the server that you see right there. And then we're not doing anything with roles, so I'm going to go right over to Features, where I need to go down to the User Interface and Infrastructure. And I would deselect Server Graphical Shell and Graphical Management Tools and Infrastructure. Notice that also removes Windows PowerShell ISE. ISE, the reason why it removes that is because that actually uses a GUI. It's a method for working with PowerShell where it kind of gives you some hints and it gives you some a UI that you can fill in certain things with. Anyway, I'm going to remove those features, click on Next, and then once this is all done and it reboots, we're going to see that we're going to go back to a pure Server Core installation. Alright, so here we are back at Server Core again after having removed those features. Now, I want to point out that I also provide for you full PowerShell instructions in the PowerShell cheat sheet, not only for going from core to the GUI, which you already saw me do earlier, but also PowerShell instructions for going from the GUI server back down to core, which I used Server Manager to do in this case, but there is also PowerShell commandlets for that. Basically, instead of install, you do uninstall. Now, to re-sum up some of the things that we looked at there, one of the things I mentioned was that you can switch from a full installation to core, the advantage there being that you install full, use the GUI to configure it, and then switch from the configured full server, now that you've got it all configured the way you want it, over to core to give it a small footprint and yet still easy to remotely manage. You can just enjoy the benefits of core then. Also, I will show you this. Don't take this take this with a grain of salt so far, because this is a work in progress. As I record, I will add more to this, and I'll probably change the formatting to make some things more readable. But this just gives you kind of a sneak preview of the PowerShell cheat sheet. These are some of the PowerShell commands that you would use. For example, I showed you this one. If you wanted to go from core to full, you'd import Server Manager, and then you would go to, do the rest of this. For some reason my mouse won't select it exactly what I want. But there you go. This is the new version of Office, so maybe I'm just not getting used to it yet. Anyway, so that's the command there. Another thing you could do is you could use the Deployment Imaging and Service Management tool, and this gives you the language or the syntax of how you would need to type that in if you wanted to use it instead of PowerShell. All right, let's also take a look at something called Features on Demand. The advantage of this is that it allows you to slim down the hard disk footprint of your core or full installation. I mean, if you take a look at previous versions of Windows, you would know that when you install, even Server Core in 2008, let's say you never decided to make it a DNS server or a domain controller or a certification authority or a NAP server, any of those kinds of things. Guess what? Even though you don't decide to install any of those roles or features, the binaries that make it possible to install those items are still on disk, and they still consume space. So what Features on Demand allows us to do is to not only not use those features, but to not use the disk space that those binaries require. So we can remove those unused features from disk. The binaries are actually called payload by Microsoft on disk, and what we want to do is to remove those. Later on, if you change your mind and say, you know what, I didn't want it to be a domain controller, but now I do, you can put the binaries back later on if needed. If you were, for example, to install that feature using PowerShell, it would put those back on for you. Now, one thing to point out, I don't have this in the notes right here, so one thing to point out is if you do put these things back later, then it will either get the source files from Windows Update, okay, which could take a long time because there could be gigabytes worth of downloads it needs to do to be able to get those out of there. Or the other option there would be to use a source. You would have to have a mounted WIM file from the installation media on disk somewhere. And without going into all of that, what we do with this is you can mount the source files that appear on the Server 2012 DVD onto a disk space and kind of expose them and make them available, in this case, as source files. You can't just point directly only to the CD, though, or the DVD. Also, the method for doing this, to use Features on Demand, is to use PowerShell. And one thing that's very cool about this is you can even use this on virtual hard disks. So, what is a virtual hard disk? Well, if we go back over to our Hyper-V machine, okay, actually, let me close this up. Here's my physical machine, Hyper-V Nugget 1, HV Nugget 1. Here's a virtual machine, Core, over here, and then Full down here. Core is not running right now, but I do want to show you something about this. If I go take a look at the settings, then if I take a look at the hard drive, I can see that there's a file path for this. It's under Users, Public, Documents, Hyper-V, Virtual Hard Disks, and then the name of the actual VHDX is this big old long name here, and it's a AVHDX. Okay. Normally, for an installed operating system on physical hardware, you install it on platters, right? Spinning hard disks or solid-state drives. For a virtual machine, this is actually a physical file that appears on the hard disk, but this virtual machine that we're looking at here will see it as spinning disks. Now what I can do is I could take this Core installation and I could actually modify it even without the machine being turned on, while it's still in a dormant, offline disk state. It cannot be turned on, so you can see that it's off right now. Now, the way you actually remove these binaries is you can do so locally at the console where you are. So I could just right-click here and choose to run as administrator, and then I would open up a PowerShell prompt, and then I could execute the appropriate command. I'm not going to do that right now because I've actually already done that in advance because it takes a while. So I have another PowerShell prompt that I'll show you here in a minute. The other thing you could do is you could point it to a remote machine. So the PowerShell commands that you do use, you can use the -computer flag and then enter in the name of the destination computer where you want to perform this function of removing the binaries. So there's a couple of ways of doing it. The other way you could do it is this. You could actually do it to a VHD. Now, let's go back to our virtual machines here. You see that I've got these two, which I've referenced previously. Well, these virtual machines, they don't actually have their own physical spinning platters. Normally when you install an operating system on physical hardware, it's got a hard disk, a literal hard disk, and that's where you install the operating system files, right? Well, with a virtual machine, it actually is a single file known as a VHD, or with Windows Server 2012, there's a new format, a VHDX, which gives you certain additional advantages. Now, these VHDX files will kind of fool these operating systems into thinking that they're spinning platters, but in reality, they're just large files on spinning platters, on my physical spinning platters. Let me show you what I mean by that. If I go here to my local hard disk, and then I go to users and public, and you don't need to memorize this path or anything like that. I'm just showing you where my VHD files are. And then public documents, and then Hyper-V, virtual hard disks. You can see that I've got several virtual hard disks right here, VHDXs. All right. Now that's really all it is. The operating system that's the guest operating system, it thinks that these things are spinning platters, but they're really just large files. Look, they're usually about 5-6 gigabytes on the hard drive. All right. Now, what I want to do here is to open up a PowerShell prompt, which I've already run, and this is the syntax that you'll use. Again, this is all available for you on the cheat sheet, so you don't have to write this down. What you want to do is to uninstall a Windows feature, and then you'll name it. And then in this case, it would be, for example, the GPMC, which is the Group Policy Management Console, a very handy tool to configure how users and computers can operate within a domain. That's kind of the short answer. We'll get more detail later on in this series. And then I could just leave it at that. If this was a local, if I was locally trying to work with this, and on this same machine that we're looking at right now, I want to remove that feature. That's what I do. But it doesn't actually do anything without this remove item down here in terms of removing the binaries. That's the key there. Anytime you see a remove flag, like I've highlighted right there, that's your clue that you are using features on demand. Okay, that's what that really is doing. Now, in this case, what I've decided to do is not to do it just locally on the machine we're looking at here. I want to do it to a VHD file that's in the path that I mentioned earlier. Okay, and this is the VHD file for, actually it's a level deeper than what we were looking at before, but this is a VHDX file for my full installation of Windows Server 2012, and I want to remove the group policy components for there from the binaries. So when it was done, this took a long time, by the way, to remove that. And when it was done, it was true. It tells me it does not need a restart, and it was successful, and it removed this group policy management item. Now, I want to talk to you about something called the minimal server interface. The thing is, this is not really one of the exam objectives, but I think it should be because it's really right in line with a lot of the other stuff I've been talking about in this nugget. The purpose of the minimal server interface is that it's another footprint reducer. It reduces the size of the hard disk space. Also reduces patching. If you think about what's going on with this, is it's going to take away a lot of the UI, but not all of it. Now, since a lot of patches relate to the UI, the more UI you take away, the less patching you have. Also, this is kind of a compromise between Core and Full. Maybe you like a lot of the features of Core. A slimmer operating system, not a lot of graphical user interface, or none really. But you kind of miss some of the things that are involved in Full, such as using Server Manager. Wouldn't it be nice if you could kind of have a little bit of both? Well, that's what you get with minimal server interface. This will strip away the desktop. So you won't have that. It'll also strip away the start screen, and that's what we have right here. The start screen right here. You'll also not have Windows Explorer, so you won't be able to browse for hard drives using Windows Explorer, for example. And it also strips out Internet Explorer, so no more shopping for Amazon.com on your server, people. You'll have to do that on your desktop computer. Also, but you will have remaining, even after you make it a minimal server interface, you'll still have Server Manager. And that's really the big feature that a lot of administrators missed with Server Core, because they still want to be able to right-click on something, go to the properties of it, check some boxes somewhere, that kind of thing. And you'll also get the MMC and any of the snap-ins, such as Active Directory users and computers, computer management, that type of thing. And you'll also get a subset of Control Panel. It doesn't have all of the goodies there because not all of them apply anymore. However, you will get a subset of it at least. Now, in order to configure this, you can use either Server Manager or PowerShell as usual. If you want to take a core installation, in other words, when you first installed the OS, you decided to install it as a core server, but now you decide you want to go to minimal server interface. How do you do that? Well, you still use PowerShell for that one, or Server Manager remotely. But when you do this, it's going to require source files that are not there, because since you installed it as core, it didn't collect the UI files. So how do you get those? Well, it will collect those automatically from Windows Update. if you don't specify an installation media. However, when it does this from Windows Update, you're taking a look at gigabytes worth of download there, so be prepared for that. Better if you can point it to media instead. Alright, so how would I do this from the console of a full UI? What I could do here is to go to Manage. Actually, I could use PowerShell, or I could use the Manage tools here. And I'm just going to... sometimes I click on this, nothing happens. Let's try it again. Remove roles and features. Okay, and then the next thing I would do here be just click on Next, select the local server, and then we will skip past this portion, the roles, and we'll go right to the features, where we'll again go to the section we looked at earlier for the user interfaces and infrastructure. Now, let me give you another tip here. If I wanted to switch to core, I would clear both of these checkboxes, remove that one and remove that one, and then this would actually become a core computer at this point. In this case, however, I don't really want to do that. What I want to do is to simply leave this one checkbox, and you can see here that it's going to leave the minimal server interface that supports GUI and management tools. So then I'll go ahead and click on Next, and then it's going to require a restart, I think, so I'm going to go ahead and check that box to restart it when it's done. And then we'll remove. When this is done, we'll take a look at what the UI looks like. Alright folks, just in the sense of full disclosure, let me tell you what happened. Since I paused recording, the machine crashed horribly. So I just went ahead and did the same function. I just used the same removal of the server graphical shell on a different server that I had that was running several other services here. And it does the same thing. Now once it reboots, you see that it's told me here that the feature succeeded. Feature removal succeeded, so I click OK there. Now notice that if I minimize this, I don't have a desktop. This looks a lot like core. So I've got this thing, the command prompt that I usually would have, and server manager. And if I wanted to work with any kind of other services here, I could right click here, on this server, and then open up the DNS manager so I have my MMC consoles. But notice that I don't have any kind of Internet Explorer or any other bells and whistles. Next thing I might want to do, though, is let's say I changed my mind and I wanted to go back again to installing and to go to a full version of Server Core. Well, for that I could go back to add roles and features. Okay, and then I just go back into where exactly you would think I would go, which is down here under the user interfaces and infrastructure. Then I'd recheck that box. Alternatively, I could use PowerShell. Alright, now here I've gone back to a full UI, and the reason why I've done this is because, and by the way I can prove that, and just look at the desktop. Okay, so I went back to a full UI here, and then I just wanted to show you how you would do this with PowerShell. I use an uninstall Windows feature, server, GUI shell. These are all in the cheat sheet. And then here I did a what if. This is simply, not really a lot of data here for us in this case, but sometimes you'll have an application or something or some other Windows feature or component that actually depends on the server graphical shell, and so you might want to be aware of the consequences of that, and it'll give you a heads up about that. And then I went to an uninstall Windows Server GUI shell without the what if, just to go ahead and do the whole thing. I forgot to put the hyphen restart on there, that flag, but certainly when it's done I can manually restart this server. By the way, if it seems to take a long time and you don't get any feedback from the PowerShell console, just press enter every now and then, and you'll see that sometimes this thing just doesn't seem to refresh itself very well. Apparently it had been waiting on me the whole time, but none of this data here appeared showing that it was finished until I pressed the enter key. So that's what we've got there. Now you can also shut down, by the way, this is a quick tip for you, using a command prompt. So I want to restart. That's what the /R is. And then T means time of 0 in this case, meaning I don't want to wait. It's just restarting right now. And when it comes back up, it'll be back to what we saw earlier, the minimal server interface. Alright, now here we've gone back to the minimal server install. If I want to go back to a full UI, then I'll do an install Windows feature, server GUI shell. It tells me that I would need to restart, and then I'll again just shut down and restart in order to get back to that point. And I have a full UI. Another exam objective calls for us to be able to add and remove features in offline images. What's that talking about? Well, remember with virtualization, these virtual machines actually exist on a VHD. In order to be able to do what I'm talking about here, we'd have to have a machine that's off, not one that's running, but one that's off. And with that machine being off, I can go to Manage, add roles and features, or remove them if that's my objective. Both other sides of the same coin is all this really is. And then I would move this up to click Next, and then next, and then here instead of selecting from the server pool where I have my single server right now, I would select a virtual hard disk and then I would browse for it. Then what I would do is and I've got this one in kind of a weird location, so I'm just going to go to Program Data, Microsoft, and then Windows, and then Hyper-V, and then Debug, because I was working with some problems with this one, so I was just kind of working out some things with it. But there's my virtual hard disks. And there's the machine that I want to add or remove a feature from. Okay, so I want to go ahead and open that, and then I would click on Next. And then what it has to do is it has to kind of analyze it and check it out for a little while. This takes a little bit of time sometimes. And then once it's done identifying what roles and features are already installed there, it gives me the option to checkbox whatever else I want to add in. Okay, finally this shows up. This took a long time, folks. So now what I would say is maybe I want to make this a DNS server, and of course it needs to add additional features in order to make that happen. This is just telling me that based on what it sees there, it can't tell if it has a static IP address or not. Generally, you want a static IP address on a DNS server, but since that's not our main point here, I can always go in and change that later. I'll go ahead and click on Next. Again, here if I wanted to add whatever else I wanted to, just checkbox the items that you like. That you want to add. Then I just click Next, Next, and Finish, and install, and that's pretty much it. There's not really a need to restart the destination server because it's already turned off, so I'll just go ahead and click on Install, and then we'll be done. Alright, finally this succeeded, as you can see here. And then I would just close this, and then the next time I started up that virtual machine, we would then have DNS services installed on that machine. And as you can imagine, in order to uninstall it, you would simply deselect that checkbox after having gone up here to remove roles and features. Alright, now if I wanted to do the same thing from a command prompt, what would I type? Well, we would be similar to what we've seen in the past. We would do just install Windows feature, and then we would specify the name of the service. But sometimes you're not exactly sure what Microsoft would call it. Would they call it install Windows feature DNS server, DNS services, or just DNS? Who knows? So you can get that information by going to Get Windows Feature, and that will show you all of the available commands, or rather PowerShell options that you can use with that particular one. In this case, we're looking for DNS. Let's see, it should be alphabetical, so there's DNS right here, and it says DNS is the name that I would type in there underneath name that you see over here. So I'm going to go ahead and clear the screen here and type that in. And you can see what I've done here. I'm just going to install Windows feature DNS, and I'm pointing it to a VHD, and then we'll just press enter and let it run. Then, of course, it tells me that it was successful. I don't need to restart it. It's already turned off anyway. And then next time I started it up, we would have DNS, and we could go ahead and start configuring it. In this nugget, we took a look at how to enable remote desktop. This is important for training purposes so I can show you things, but it's also important for your own purposes so that you can remotely administer servers across your enterprise. We looked at how to switch installation modes so that we're not any longer stuck with either core or a full GUI, but we can switch back and forth as necessary. We looked at features on demand, which is really more like removing features on demand. Because now, rather than just disabling a certain feature that you don't use, you can actually also remove those binaries and save yourself some disk space. Save yourself even more disk space by using the minimal server interface, which is kind of a compromise between core and a full GUI, as we saw. We also saw that we could add and remove features in offline images. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.